What's up, nerds? Welcome back to Jed Studio. My name is Robbie, and it is Star Wars month and release day for The Mandalorian and Grogu, so naturally you'd think we're sculpting Mando and Grogu, right? Nope. We're making Darth Maul. Simply just because he looks cooler, not at all because I forgot the other movie released today. I admit it, I'm not the biggest Star Wars fan. I mean, I like it, it's fun to watch, but I don't have the encyclopedic knowledge of all the comics and cartoons and books and so on, so I'm kinda just like your basic white girl version of a Star Wars fan. But I still remember going to the movie theater way back when Phantom Menace came out, and I still remember seeing Maul for the first time, just lingering in the background of that awesome Drew Struzan movie poster. R.I.P. Drew. And the funny thing is that despite barely talking at all in episode 1, he still became one of the most memorable characters in the franchise, in my opinion, entirely off of the strength of looking unbelievably cool and moving around like a caffeinated ninja spider. Not to mention, he's basically like the Star Wars version of the Black Knight from Monty Python and the Holy Grail, because he totally got cut in half at the end of episode 1 and apparently didn't die because he continued to make appearances later in comics and various animated series. And don't come at me for spoilers, it's been like 27 years. Phantom Menace came out the same year as Sopranos and SpongeBob, which both feel old as hell, so you've had time to watch it. But his impact on the franchise outweighed his time on screen big time, just because the character was so damn cool that Lucas changed his mind and brought him back to life so that the character could live on. So that's my reason for wanting to sculpt Maul. He's just cool. Sometimes that's good enough. While babbling, I've been working on the hands, and I want to have one holding that crazy cool double-bladed lightsaber while the other is extended out in that cliche Force pose, because Maul has the Force, and if you got it, flaunt it. Most of my sculptures and paintings are caricatures, which means the proportions are exaggerated, so I typically like to make the hands and get them attached to the armature wire skeleton before I get started on the forearms. That way I can blend the forearm into the hands with a smoother transition instead of having to hide a seam or a clunky transition. But the biggest exaggeration in a caricature is typically the head, which means it's not going to sit on the shoulders the same way it would with normal proportions. I don't really want this to feel like a bobblehead where the head is just completely disconnected from the body. I still want it to read as one solid, believable figure, even if the proportions are completely ridiculous. Because of that, I'll sometimes pause work on the body and start on the head earlier than I normally would. That way, once his head is finished, I can build the upper body around it and make sure everything flows together properly. Or at least as properly as a tiny angry space demon with a watermelon-sized head can look. Of course, I could always start with the head first, but I'm somewhat limited by the size of the oven I use to bake these. So to make sure everything actually fits, I usually start with measuring out the armature wire as you saw earlier, then build out a base layer of the body, and then determine how large the head can realistically be from there. Every now and then I'll try to get creative with how I set the sculpts into the oven, and I try to bake the head separate from the body when I can to allow for bigger projects, but for the most part I stick with 4-inch bodies. To make Maul's face, I begin by wrapping a softer clay, and in this case original Sculpey, around a ball of aluminum foil to add bulk without wasting clay. Then I layer on some Premo Sculpey, which is the beige colored clay here, to start shaping the face. The original is soft and the Premo is firmer, which holds detail better, but you could honestly use either of these types of clay to do the whole sculpt. But I like mixing them because they behave differently and have slightly different textures due to the difference in softness. I tend to use the softer clay while I'm building up and blending larger forms like muscles or general mass, and then I switch to the firmer clay when I want sharper detail and cleaner edges. Some people will say that the original is more of a beginner's clay, while Premo is better for more experienced users, but I think they both have their purpose. For example, you can see with the original Sculpey how easily it moves and blends, but also picks up a lot of imperfections like all those fingerprints. Compared to the Premo, it still blends pretty well once I've softened it, but the edges it leaves behind are much cleaner and crisper and not as gummy. The firmer clay can still pick up fingerprints, but not nearly as much as the softer clay, and it can be easier to smooth the firmer clay out to a clean finish without needing to sand it afterwards. It's a bit like working with earthenware clay as it goes through different stages of moisture. When it's soft and wet, it's easy to push around, but as it firms up to a leather-hard stage, you can really refine the texture and get a cleaner detail. So I'm more or less mimicking that concept, just with different types and softnesses of polymer oven-baked clay instead of a ceramic clay. Of course, there are a handful of polymer clay brands out there like Fimo and Serenit and Cosclay, which is some really good stuff, and I'd like to experiment with that one more. But Sculpey is what I have the most experience with, mostly just because it's the easiest to find in my area, so that's my go-to brand. For now. Anyway, once I got the face built up, I used a bit of rubbing alcohol and a brush to clean off my fingerprints and slightly break up the surface. It helps to smooth things out while also giving the face a more natural, believable texture instead of that overly clean, just sculpted look. Then I make sure the camera is nice and out of focus as I get started on his ears before throwing it in the oven to bake. Just to pull it out of the oven with my uncoordinated sausage fingers, which ended up breaking the ear right back off. Luckily, I was able to recover the pieces, and with the help of some polymer clay glue and a quick rebake, it was good as new, and I didn't have to sculpt the ear all over again, which made my day because I hate sculpting ears. They don't make sense to me. With that crisis averted, I got to work adding the mounds for Maul's head full of horns. I squished on a little ball and then blended it in with a ball stylus and rubbing alcohol, and then shoved in a little pre-baked horn that I made with a semi-transparent clay. I then repeated the process 9 more times, which magically helps our face change from just some random grumpy guy to actually starting to look like Maul. Though, to be fair, the black and red face pattern is really what makes the character, but we're getting there. Once the final horn is in place, we're ready to throw the head back on the body so we can make the neck. Because Maul's outfit has that kind of high collar, we can get away with making this head removable, as the neck doesn't have to clearly blend into the body like it did with my Kratos or middle-aged Mutant Ninja Turtle sculpts. With the head more or less taken care of, I'm ready to return to finishing out the body, and to keep it simple, I think I'll work from bottom to top, feet to torso, instead of jumping around like I normally do. At least that's the plan, but I have no attention span at all, so we'll see how long that plan lasts. Since his ninja-looking pants are tucked into the boots, I want to finish them first before adding the top portion of the boot. So that was like, what, 5 or 6 seconds before I abandoned the plan and started jumping around, so I just absolutely nailed it. Anyway, if you watched my Dungeon Crawler Carl sculpt of Carl and Donut, you already know I have very little experience with sculpting feet. If you haven't seen it, go pay the daddy tax and watch it. But since my feet are usually just little balls of clay that I mostly ignore and hope no one notices, I decided it's time I take some baby steps and try to make them look slightly more believable. After the feet, I started layering on various strips of clay to build up the shape of Maul's sleeves before blending it all together. I then repeated the process on the other sleeve before adding the, this shape. Yeah, I don't know what that is. The clothes in Star Wars are wild. Some cool, some are like, what the hell is that? Like the Mandalorians and Stormtroopers have super cool armor, and Han Solo has his sweet 70s looking vest with some skinny jeans, and Cassian from Andor has some pretty dope jackets. Then Cal wears that weird ass poncho, and Rey and Little Annie look like they're dressed in gauze. All that to say, Star Wars clothes are weird, but Maul still pulls off his little emo outfit. I added some dangling strips to make his kilt looking thing, and then wrapped a strip of Premo around them for his belt or cummerbund or whatever that is. I don't know, man. Finally, I added one last strip for the robe-looking collar thing, and with that, the sculpting is all done. But before we get started on painting the head, I realized I liked the bone look of the semi-transparent clay that I used for the horns, so I decided to apply a coat of liquid mask to protect the horns from the paint. Now, I've had this bottle of liquid mask for many years, and I haven't opened it since I made Frankenstein's monster, which was my first video on this channel, and oh man, it should have stayed closed. I cracked that sucker open and it smelled like raw ass, but I used it anyway on the horns and the eyes. Once the mask was dry, I started the paint by applying a base coat of flat red. I don't want any gloss on his face, as I plan on adding that later myself. I added a small amount of mild highlights here and there, but the bulk of the face will be covered with his black markings, so I didn't spend too much time with color variations in the red. I used a pencil to sketch out the markings before committing to them with paint, and then again used the flattest black that I owned to fill in the markings. The design on the face really simplifies the painting process, as it reduces the time and effort to make the skin tones look right and believable, but it also runs the risk of looking too flat. But I think I have an idea that I'll add later to keep that from happening. Once the black design was done and dry, then added a red rim at the base of all the horns before removing the liquid mask. When you're using the mask on paper with watercolors or whatever, it's easy to remove it with a gum eraser, but on a 3D figure it can be a little tricky. So I slowly and very impatiently removed it little by little with a plethora of tools, and finally got it all off to reveal a clean set of horns and eyes. After that, I added the red and yellow layers of Maul's eyes and then dotted them with a black pupil. Then I applied a brown wash to the horns to stain rather than paint to keep that semi-transparent bone look. Finally, to keep the face from looking flat with all the large patterns of paint, I added little dots of a gloss varnish here and there to accent the features and try to imply a little more shape to the face, as if those features were catching the light and shining through the color. With the head done, I'm ready to get started on the body, which is basically just different variants of black. Starting with a flat black for the clothes and a glossy black for the shoes and belt and gloves. But since all these clothes are just black and my tabletop is black, it was all starting to blend together. So let's bring out our handy dandy light gray pad thing so I can actually see what I'm doing. There we go. Ain't that something? Anyway, I am working toward it, but I'm still a long way from hyperrealism, so I'm not detailing these clothes enough to show clearly that this fabric is cotton and that one's polished leather. But varying the levels of gloss can help imply those differences at least a little, just through the way the surface catches and reflects the light. To push that a little further, I used some flatter grays to add some mild highlights to the cloth so it wasn't just one flat mess of black. Then after adding whatever these dots are to whatever this belt is, I get started with his lightsaber. Not too crazy with the detail because I want the focus to be on the face, but just enough to somewhat resemble Maul's handle. Then I paint a sharpened dowel rod red and do some neon type coloring to make the swords, and then attach them to the handle with some UV resin, which helps set it in place quickly without me having to hold it steady with super glue. Then lastly, I brushed on a little red to add glow from the lightsaber, and with that, Maul is ready for the shelf. Well, as always, I hope you enjoyed this little project of a huge-headed Darth Maul. If you haven't already, do me a favor and give the video a like, and subscribe to the channel if you want to see what we make next time, especially if you're a fan of Masters of the Universe. But that about does it for now, so thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.